I still remember the day I first arrived at the Galactic Academy. It was supposed to be a grand moment, a historic first, the first human student ever accepted into the most prestigious interstellar institution of higher learning. I should have been excited, honored even, but as I stepped out of the shuttle and into the vast, gleaming halls of the station, I couldn't help but feel the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. The academy itself was a marvel of engineering, a structure floating in deep space, designed to accommodate dozens of species from across the known galaxy. The air was a carefully balanced mix of oxygen, nitrogen, and trace gases that allowed most biological life forms to breathe comfortably. Gravity fields shifted in various hallways, creating different zones where species from low or high-gravity planets could move with ease. It was a place of perfect harmony, a beacon of unity and knowledge, where war and violence were distant relics of the past. And then there was me, Jason Carter, a human, a Deathworlder. It wasn't an insult exactly, it was a classification. Earth had long been labeled a Class 5 death world, a planet teeming with disasters, apex predators, aggressive microorganisms, and an evolutionary arms race so brutal that the mere act of surviving childhood was, to some species, a biological miracle. Humans were the only sapient species to emerge from such a chaotic environment, and because of that, we were considered natural. The moment I stepped into the main hall, I saw the way they looked at me. Not with hostility, no, that would have been easier to deal with. It was a quiet, wary curiosity, as if they were expecting me to bare my teeth and attack at any moment. Conversations hushed as I walked by, clusters of students parting slightly, giving me just a little more space than necessary. Even those who tried to be polite kept their distance. I understood it. Most of my fellow students had grown up in worlds where conflict had been solved eons ago. They didn't have wars. They didn't need militaries. And their medicine had advanced so far that injuries were rare and recovery was effortless. They didn't know what it meant to hurt the way humans did. So when they saw me, a representative of a species that had survived everything the universe threw at us through sheer stubbornness and raw adaptability, they couldn't help but wonder, what is he capable of? For the first few weeks, no one spoke to me unless absolutely necessary. They watched, they whispered, but they never engaged. I was the unknown variable, the unpredictable element, and in a school built on order and reason, I didn't fit. That all changed the day I walked into Professor Keycat's medical emergency response class. The class was held in one of the academy's many training halls, a large, sterile-looking room with sleek white walls and interactive holo displays. The ceiling pulsed with soft blue lights, signaling a controlled environment, one where even the most fragile of species wouldn't have to worry about contamination. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, a universal scent, I supposed, since even across different biologies, infection was something every species wanted to avoid. Professor Keycat stood at the front, his tall insectoid frame poised with practiced precision. He belonged to the Curlian species, an advanced and highly respected race known for their medical expertise. His chitinous body gleamed under the artificial lights, and his compound eyes darted across the room, studying us the way a scientist might study specimens. "Today," he announced, clicking his mandibles together, "we begin our study of interspecies first aid. As future scholars, diplomats, and engineers, it is not enough to understand your own biology. You must also understand how to respond in an emergency when dealing with other species." A ripple of acknowledgement passed through the students. Some of them seemed excited, others more apprehensive. I noticed that a few of the more gelatinous-bodied species, like the Velco, seemed particularly nervous. Their bodies lacked bones, and their wounds were more about structural integrity than actual bleeding. Even the concept of something as mundane as a deep cut was alien to them. Professor Keychat continued, "Each of you will learn the fundamentals of treating injuries, based on different biological compositions. Some species coagulate rapidly, some require external stabilizers, and some regenerate naturally if given time. Today, we will begin with basic wound care. The first demonstration was straightforward. A YARFX student, a reptilian being with hardened scales, volunteered for the simulation. The professor activated a hollow wound on their arm, mimicking a deep laceration. Their species, we learned, clotted almost instantly. Treatment involved sealing the wound with a special antiseptic gel, followed by a light compression wrap to keep the injury stabilized. Next, a Velcro student demonstrated how their species handled injuries. Their physiology was closer to a thick, gelatinous liquid, meaning that cuts weren't the problem, ruptures were. If a Velcro was wounded, the focus wasn't stopping bleeding, but instead binding their structure together with specialized polymers until their body could reabsorb the damage. Everything was neat, logical, precise. Then it was my turn. Professor Quixote gestured toward me, his mandibles twitching slightly. Now, we will examine human emergency care. I stepped forward, ignoring the way the other students subtly leaned away from me. Depends on the injury, I said, crossing my arms. Humans don't clot as fast as YARFX, and we don't have natural structural regeneration like the Velcro. So if we get an open wound, we have to stop the bleeding fast. Quixote nodded. And how would you accomplish this? I hesitated, then shrugged. We use whatever we have available. That was the moment everything started going wrong. The room was silent as all eyes turned toward me. I could feel the weight of their stares, their thinly veiled unease at what I might say next. I didn't think much of it. I mean, first aid was first aid. Everyone here had already seen some strange alien medical techniques, and this was just another lesson. So, I started explaining, if we have a med kit, the first thing we do is apply pressure to the wound to slow the bleeding. Then we disinfect it to prevent infection. After that, we either use stitches, medical glue, or, if it's really bad, we might need a skin graft. A few students nodded along, though I noticed some slight shifts, flicking tendrils, twitching antennae, and subtle color changes in their skin, all signs of discomfort. I assumed they just weren't used to the idea of a species needing to manually close their wounds, instead of letting their bodies handle it naturally. Professor Quixote, however, seemed intrigued. And, in the absence of proper medical supplies? I frowned. Well, we improvise. I should have stopped there. But no, I had to elaborate. If we don't have proper bandages, we can use torn pieces of clothing or even a belt as a makeshift tourniquet to stop arterial bleeding. That got a reaction. A few students visibly tensed. One of the YARFX curled their claws against their chest, their scales shifting to a muted shade of alarm. Tourniquets are used when we can't stop the bleeding any other way, I clarified. They cut off circulation to prevent someone from bleeding out. Sure, there's a risk of limb damage, but it's better than dying. The silence grew heavier. The Velcro student, the one who had shown us how their species could reseal their gelatinous bodies, spoke up, their voice wobbling slightly. You willingly cut off circulation to your own limbs? Well, yeah, I said. I mean, if it's a choice between losing a leg or bleeding to death, you go with the leg. A sharp clicking noise echoed through the room. It took me a second to realize that one of the Krell students, a species known for their delicate, almost crystalline bodies, had physically recoiled, their joints clicking in distress. Quixote regarded me carefully. And if a tourniquet is not an option? Well, I said, rubbing the back of my neck, there's always cauterization. That was when the screaming started. Not loud, terrified screams, but the kind of horrified, involuntary noises people make when they hear something so awful that their brains can't process it. The Velcro student collapsed into a shapeless puddle, their entire body losing cohesion. A Yarfex had turned a deep, sickly shade of green, which I assumed was their version of nausea. Even Keekshot, who had up until now maintained his calm, professional demeanor, took a step back. "You? Set yourselves on fire to stop bleeding?" someone whispered. "Only if we have to," I said quickly. "It's not ideal." That didn't seem to help. The classroom had become eerily silent. The kind of silence that didn't just mean people were listening, but that they were processing something deeply unsettling. I shifted uncomfortably under their stares, trying to figure out why they were so horrified. Sure, cauterization wasn't pleasant, but it was a last resort, a survival tactic. Humans didn't just give up when injured. We found a way to keep going. That was something to be admired, right? Apparently not. Professor Keeshot finally broke the silence, his voice carefully neutral. "You mean to say that humans have set their own wounds aflame?" "Well, not flame exactly," I corrected. "We use red-hot metal or even certain chemical reactions. Soldiers in ancient times used gunpowder, though that was a desperate measure. Modern medicine has better ways, but if you're stranded, cauterization works." The Velko had reformed just enough to emit a soft, horrified gurgle. Another student, a Vordelian with bioluminescent frills along their neck, stared at me in outright disbelief. "You mean to tell me that humans willingly endure excruciating pain just to stay alive?" I blinked. "Well, yeah. What's the alternative?" No one answered. That's when I realized what was happening. To them, pain wasn't something you just dealt with. Most of these species had biological fail-safes, automatic healing factors, advanced regenerative capabilities, or nervous systems that dulled pain so they wouldn't suffer. Some, like the Krell, had self-repairing crystalline bodies that barely even registered injuries. Pain, to them, was something avoidable, something that meant they were already beyond saving. To humans, pain was just another problem to push through. One of the Yarfex students, still looking vaguely nauseated, hesitantly raised a clawed hand. "And if you cannot burn the wound shut?" I sighed, realizing there was no way out of this. "Then we stitch it closed." Dead silence. Keek's yacht tilted his head, mandibles twitching. "You mean to say that humans willingly puncture their own flesh to sew themselves back together?" "Well, yeah. If we don't, the wound stays open and gets infected," I shrugged. "You can use sutures, medical glue, or even just tape. Honestly, if you're really desperate, you can use a needle and thread, though that's not exactly sterile." That was the final straw. One of the Krell let out a sharp, glass-like chime, which I think was their version of screaming. A Yarfex's tail thumped against the floor in distress. The Velko melted into a puddle again. Even Professor Keyzat seemed at a loss for words. I started to feel defensive. "Look, it's not like we want to do any of this. It's just what we have to do to survive." The Vordelen student's bioluminescent frills flickered in rapid, alarmed pulses. "But that's just it. You survive things that should kill you." That was when I realized why they were so afraid. It wasn't because we were violent. It was because we were almost impossible to kill. The atmosphere in the classroom had shifted. Before, the other students had regarded me with cautious curiosity, their wariness tinged with polite academic interest. Now they looked at me the way one might look at a creature that had crawled out of the void, something that shouldn't exist, yet somehow did. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. Professor Quisat recovered first, though even he took a measured step back before addressing me again. "Your species' approach to survival is remarkable." His mandibles twitched in what I hoped was respect, but I wasn't sure. "But I must ask, what happens when pain becomes too much, when the body is too damaged to continue? Surely there must be a threshold where the human body ceases function." I hesitated, then gave him an awkward smile. Yeah, about that. We don't really have an off switch the way some species do. Several students exchanged uneasy glances. One of the Krell clicked their crystalline fingers together. What do you mean? Well, I said, shifting my weight, a lot of species here have biological shutdown mechanisms. If the damage is too severe, your body stops feeling pain, or you go into stasis, or your nervous system forces you into hibernation. Humans don't really do that. Revelko, still barely holding their gelatinous form, let out a soft, horrified burble. Then, how do you know when you're beyond saving? We don't. Absolute silence. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. I mean, eventually the body will give out, sure, but until that happens, we keep going, even if we're in pain, even if we're bleeding, even if we're running on pure adrenaline, we push forward until we either make it through or we just can't anymore. And remember, the room was deathly still. I decided to make it worse. There's actually a thing called combat shock, where a human gets injured so badly that their nervous system can't keep up, and they don't even realize they're hurt until later. Like, some people have survived impalement or lost limbs and kept fighting because their brains hadn't registered it yet. That was when one of the Yarfeks fainted. Like, full-on collapsed to the floor, their scales flashing a sickly gray before their body went limp. The Krell students immediately let out a high-pitched chime of distress. The Velko melted again. I was starting to think that was just their species' default response to stress. The Vorgellan students' bioluminescent frills flashed erratically, and they took a huge step away from me, as if I might suddenly start losing limbs and not notice. Even Kishens seemed rattled. But I see, he said slowly. That is truly beyond what I had imagined. I exhaled. Look, I know it sounds bad, but it's just how we evolved. We survive. That's what humans do. The Vordellan student whispered, voice trembling. That's what makes it terrifying. The silence in the room had become unbearable. I had been through some awkward conversations before, but this was a whole new level. I had just explained basic human survival tactics, and now my classmates were looking at me like I was some kind of cosmic horror that had crawled out of the abyss. I hadn't even gotten to the part about amputations yet. Professor Quisat, to his credit, remained composed, at least on the surface, but I could see the subtle twitching of his mandibles, the way his antennae flexed ever so slightly. He was a professional, but even he wasn't immune to the growing unease in the room. Let us move forward, he said, his voice measured. You mentioned that humans lack a biological shutdown mechanism, that you will push forward despite grievous injury, but surely at some point you must require external intervention. If a human is injured beyond the point of self-repair, what happens next? I hesitated. I had already traumatized half the class, and I was pretty sure the Velko was actively trying to phase out of existence at this point. But I figured I might as well keep going. Well, if a human is badly injured, we don't just give up, I said. We use medical procedures, sure, but if things are really bad, we have something called shock management to keep people alive long enough for treatment. It's a mix of fluids, stabilizers, and sometimes, he paused, maybe I shouldn't mention induced comas or the whole restart the heart with electricity thing. Sometimes what? A Krell student asked, their crystalline voice tinged with apprehension. I sighed. Sometimes we have to, force the body to keep going, even when it doesn't want to. The room visibly recoiled. Kixat's compound eyes narrowed. Elaborate. I really didn't want to, but at this point, it felt like I had no choice. Well, I said, if someone's heart stops, we can restart it manually. A chorus of horrified noises rippled through the room. The Velkai made a noise like a bubbling scream. The Vordellan's bioluminescent frills flashed bright white, which I was pretty sure meant they were about to have a stroke. You, Yafek's student gasped, still recovering from their fainting spell. You forced the heart to restart? Yes, I said. I mean, if someone flatlines, we don't just leave them to die. We do chest compressions to keep blood flowing, and if that's not enough, we use an electric charge to jumpstart the heart. Utter chaos. One of the Krell students dropped their data pad. The Velcro had begun vibrating violently, their gelatinous body quivering with what I assumed was existential horror. A Yarfex actually hissed at me. Quixat, still holding on to his professionalism by a thread, took a slow, careful breath. You mean to say, he said, his voice unnervingly calm, that when your body ceases function, when death has already claimed you, humans have the ability to steal themselves back from the void? I shrugged. Yeah, sometimes. The class lost their minds. The classroom was in complete disarray. Students were whispering, no, hissing, chittering, and burbling in frantic panic tones. A Krell had backed themselves into a corner, their crystalline body clicking in distress. The Belko had melted again, their gelatinous form now barely holding together. The Vordellan's bioluminescent frills were still flashing erratically, a clear sign of mental overload. Professor Keyjot was silent. His compound eyes locked on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I shifted uncomfortably. Look, I don't know why you're all freaking out. This is just basic first aid. It's not like we're immortal or anything. Keeksat exhaled slowly. I believe that is precisely the issue. Jason Carter. I frowned. What do you mean? The Krell student, still huddled in their corner, spoke in a shaky voice. We are taught that death is absolute, that when a body ceases function, there is no return. They gestured at me with a trembling hand. But your species defies that. I blinked. It's not defying anything. We just have ways to bring people back if we act fast enough. That's the problem, the Yarfek students snapped, their tail thumping against the floor. You don't accept death. You fight it. You rip yourselves back from the abyss with sheer force. No other species does this. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Okay. When they put it that way, I kind of saw the issue. Most of these species came from civilizations that had long since left behind suffering. Their medical technology prevented catastrophic injuries before they could happen. Their bodies had evolved to regenerate or shut down pain so they wouldn't have to endure what humans did. And then here I was, casually explaining that if a human's heart stopped, we'd just shock it back to life and keep going. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Look, I get that this is weird for you guys, but this is just how we survive. We don't have fancy regeneration or biological safety mechanisms. We adapt, we push through, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be here. The class fell silent again, but this time it wasn't horrified silence. It was something else. Understanding. A Vordellan student hesitated, then finally spoke. Is that why your kind has spread so far, despite coming from a death world? I gave a small smile. Probably. The Krell, still visibly shaken, let out a sound like cracking glass. It is terrifying. Maybe, I admitted. But it's also why we never give up. Professor Keyjot finally straightened, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he inclined his head. I believe we have learned something far greater than first aid today. I chuckled. Yeah, what's that? He regarded me with something I swore was respect. That humans are not just survivors. His mandibles twitched. You are conquerors of death itself.